Howdy, all. This is Dr. John. I want to apologize. I'm a couple minutes late today. I was actually tied up in another webinar, so couldn't quite get here. I'm going to talk today. I'm going to finish what I started last week a little bit. In fact, I'm going to use the same presentation. I'm just going to continue it a little bit further. And I'm going to be looking at, the question was about anxiety and whether the gut connection can stimulate anxiety and or depression. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So anxiety and depression, brain on fire. And the question was, I've read that anxiety and depression can be caused by gut inflammation. Is there good evidence for this? And how common is it? And I said, oh my God, there's tons of evidence. And one of the things to remember is that the massive increase. Anxiety has gone from 8% roughly to over 25% between 2019 and the present. Now, 8.1 was way too high. 25, quarter of the people walking around are having diagnosed anxiety. That's people who are being told by their doctors that they medically have an anxiety condition. And you can multiply that a few times when you look at the people that are actually also have anxiety and don't count on that number. And depression almost quadrupled, again, up to over 24%. And I went through a lot of the reasons that that happens. And if you're interested, you can take a look at that. But we see some of the, just the fear, the panic, the hopelessness, overuse of news media and social media. If you have anxiety, you just have to shut everything off. If you can't fix it, don't watch it. If you can't help the people in Nigeria, don't watch something about Nigeria. You have to, at this point, protect your health and know that is not hiding your head in the sand. You can't change what you can't change. Now, if you're going to devote your life to changing those things, God bless you. I'll support you. If you're not, and you have anxiety, get out of the news media. They're lying 99% of the time anyway. They make this stuff up. I used to have a channel that I'd go through that it would hit 20 different news or media platforms that happen on one day. They were saying the same exact thing word for word. It was all coming down from on high. It was all structured and it was all designed for a particular reason. And the reason was not to make you feel better. I guarantee that. So don't trust it. Don't turn it on. Don't bother. It just makes, there's a direct correlation between the use of social media and an increase in depression. So don't put yourself at risk. Okay, then you have too much alcohol use, too much junk food that cause gut inflammation. So I'm going to talk again about the gut inflammation, including leaky gut, food sensitivities, and microbiome disorders. Now, I'm not going to get all the way into those. I'm going to do a separate presentation on leaky gut food sensitivities. I'm going to talk more about what you can do about anxiety short-term and testing that can be done for anxiety. And then either next week or a couple weeks after that, we'll get into more of the leaky gut food sensitivity issues. So, and this is from Ron Grisanti, who is the president of Functional Medicine University, one of the top people around, one of the top colleges, universities that is certifying people in functional medicine. And from him, he says, unfortunately, it may just be possible that the neurotransmitter paradigm simply is antiquated and does not address the underlying root causes of these mental disorders. Neurotransmitter paradigm, what's he talking about? Okay. He says, after reading and researching, doing a deep dive into possible root causes of these mental disorders, I found something amazing and life-changing. And so what he's pointing to is that the prevailing theories that most doctors are working from is that it's all about a few neurotransmitters. If we could just give you more serotonin, you'd feel good. Well, mostly those SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, do not test out better than placebo. There are many herbs that test out way ahead of those. There's certain nutritional substances that test way ahead of the SSRIs. And with anxiety, we just have to calm you down, give you some benzodiazepines. Okay, well, tons of side effects there. So, and maybe it's all wrong, right? They just made it up and then created drugs to treat it that are not very effective. So we've got things like Zoloft, Lexapro, Prozac, et cetera. And then we have the benzodiazepines. You got Ativan, Xanax, Valium, Klonopin. And many of those are actually even hard to get a prescription for anymore, Ativan and Xanax, which I think is unfortunate because for short-term use, like you're going to take an airplane flight. And I've had people call me and say, hey, do you treat anxiety? And I said, well, heck yeah, it's the number one thing we treat in Chinese medicine. And they say, oh, okay, well, I think I'll come see you. And I'll say, do you have anxiety regularly? They said, no, only when I'm going to fly. How many times do you fly? Oh, 2-3 times a year. Then go get a prescription for Ativan. 2-3 times a year, that's not going to hurt you. It's inexpensive, it's effective, and you don't need to come see me for anxiety that you usually don't have, right? But long-term use or regular use is very, very dangerous. Okay. And what he said was, this is Ron saying this, what I discovered that was while nutrient deficiencies do play a role, the major eye-opener was the fact that depression, anxiety, and other mental disorders are largely inflammatory in nature. Now, I got to tell you, there are good studies going back into the 1950s that were done using B vitamin therapies that were incredibly effective, and they're doing other nutrient therapies that were extremely effective. So it's not new, it's just starting to get better understood and the word's getting out. Okay, cytokine storms. In the brain of people that are suffering from depression and anxiety and other health challenges, the immune system is activated, and there are clearly elevated levels of what are called inflammatory cytokines, such as interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. Fortunately, it's now much easier and more cost-effective to test for those issues, both directly and indirectly. There are tons of tests that can be done. Now, cytokine is a very general term used for small secreted proteins that are modulators of inflammation. Now, inflammation is critical. You would die with no inflammation. Inflammation is the healing process, right? You get a cut on your hand, it gets red. You get a scar tissue formation. You first get a scab. Well, those are all indicators of different forms of the inflammatory process. So the body sends out signals, cytokines, to attract other inflammatory chemicals that actually are utilized in the healing process. Then, when the healing process is complete, that should shut down again. Now, in some people, it doesn't shut down, and in other people, it just runs amok in the first place. So these cytokines can be they are a blessing and they can be a curse. And so these are produced in response to pathogens that are invading. They can be in your gut, they can be through your nose, they can be on your skin, but it's a production of cytokines to stimulate, to recruit, and cause proliferation or growth of immune cells. And so they include the interleukins, chemokines, interferons, and tumor necrosis factor, usually TNF alpha. We're not going to go into great depth about any of those. That's really a biochemistry class or a high-level immune class, but I just wanted to clarify our terms a little bit. So, in fact, that's a simple cytokine map. Okay. I was once doing a webinar, or not as a webinar, a seminar down south, and it was mostly functional medical doctors. And the guy who wrote the book on inflammation and heart disease did a presentation. Now, he pretty much got laughed out of his position for saying that the real problem with heart disease is not cholesterol. He said it's such a minor problem, it's almost not worth considering. It's all about the inflammatory process. And he proved it very clearly. But he put a chart up on the screen like this, but there were about 200 pieces to the chart. It was just mind-blowing. So as soon as you've memorized this, we'll move on a little bit. But basically, this is kind of fun to look at sometime because you can see some of the correlations here. But it's way beyond what we're going to do today. Here's a little simpler look. You can't really see it up here, but this is a pathogen that's penetrated the tissue. And this is an allergen that's penetrated the tissue. And here it's caused an infection. And here it's caused a mast cell problem. This would be an allergy or a histamine production problem. And you get an infection that comes in and activates all of these immune cells, okay, to help heal. And so these come down here to do healing. They also suppress some of the really stop healing stuff. And eventually, if it doesn't calm down, you get systemic inflammation, like the gross majority of patients in the United States have gut inflammation. And it's very easy to test. There are tons of tests to look for this. In one study that was done about 10 years ago, they took a general population that didn't touch non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And the one they particularly looked at was Advil. I don't want to give Advil a particularly bad name, or ibuprofen, I should say. And of the general population, about 10% had identifiable and provable leaky gut syndrome. The people that used ibuprofen once to twice a week, 70% had clear indications of leaky gut. So that's huge. How many people in our culture never use any of those drugs? It's not a huge number. And plus, then what we eat causes inflammation. Food allergies cause inflammation. Yeast causes inflammation in the gut. They all lead to leaky gut. Dr. Alessio, who's the expert on leaky gut, published a paper showing that every single time, not 90%, not 95%, 100% of the time that any human being eats gluten, they get transitory leaky gut. That means for some period of time after they eat the gluten, they have leaky gut. Now, the issue is then if you eat other foods at the same time or around that same time, after the leaky gut kicks in, you're liable to develop food allergies to those foods and liable to kick in more leaky gut. Now, if you already have leaky gut and you eat the gluten, then you're toast. It's just going to set your gut on fire. Okay. Now, one of the thoughts by Dr. Grisanti is that it's well known that those psychiatric medications actually don't do a lot to balance the neurotransmitters, but they do help reduce the inflammation in the brain. And maybe that's what allows them to get the meager amount of benefit that they do have. But anyway, we don't really have to look past the gut. Once gut inflammation takes hold, those cytokines start circulating through the body and also get into the brain and cause massive, massive inflammation. The secret to reducing that GI inflammation is to identify any food irritants, any bacterial pathogens, and improve optimal microbial flora. Unfortunately, this got cut off here. And some studies have found that just simply using lactobacillus rhamnosus has some promising effects on improving microbial flora and reducing anxiety. Now, I would never even dream of stopping at that one probiotic when there are so many others that are so beneficial and so many other things. But the studies show that just that can help reduce anxiety. So there's tons of studies out there showing that anyone with anxiety, depression, in fact, any mental disorder, OCD, ADHD for sure. I've treated tons of ADHD, and only 2 of my patients, maybe 3, have ended up on drugs. And one because he was too picky an eater. One, as soon as I talked to the kid, I said, you should go back to your psychiatrist and you probably need those drugs. But out of the dozens, hundreds actually of other kids I've seen, we were able to handle, get rid of their ADHD, control their problems through lifestyle and dietary changes alone. Okay, so let's take a look at anxiety. Now, everybody gets, a little worried. I don't know about everybody. There are a few Zen masters out there that probably don't get anxious ever, but most of us experience a certain amount of nervousness, apprehension when you have a stressful situation. However, what we're talking is when it becomes excessive or, very important, prolonged. So if you have you're going to do a talk in front of 500 people and you have a couple of days of anxiety, fine. Does it go away when you're at the cocktail party after? If it doesn't, then that's a problem. And so it becomes a problem of performing your daily activities. That's when you cross the road from simple worry to a full force illness and you need to treat it. Okay, that's not very clear, but it says 19 million Americans. So more than 19 million Americans are suffering from anxiety disorders. Actually, that's a very old number, and it's now much higher, particularly when you realize that 25% of the population. So that's getting us closer to 70 million people at least. So often you get people that think they're going to die in any moment, even when there's nothing fearful going on, or there's this sense of impending doom. They go to the emergency room thinking they're having a heart attack, and all the tests come back that, hey, there's nothing wrong. Have an Ambien to go to sleep, or have a Xanax to calm down, right? But it keeps coming back, and it keeps coming back, and they keep going to their doctor saying, look, there must be something wrong with me. Now, unfortunately, the person with the anxiety, they're not satisfied, obviously, who would be? And they know that something's been overlooked. So doctor runs more tests only to once again find nothing wrong. And after a while, their family and friends begin to label you a hypochondriac. It must all be in your mind, they say. Well, in a way it is, but not in the way they mean. And your friends and family are incorrect. Anxiety usually, almost always, has a physiological cause, and it's just a matter of finding that cause, remediating it, and the anxiety will get better. Now, many of the things, our habit patterns and how we think, were developed at a very, very early age, and they're really burned in. And those are hard to change. However, once you change it's like a chicken and egg, right? When someone's under anxiety for a long period of time, then their anxiety response gets easier and easier to kick in. And so if you can stop the anxiety response or slow it down a little bit, that gives the physiology a better chance to catch up and to get out of that cycle. Okay, these are just a few signs and symptoms of anxiety. Now, you can have only one of these and have severe anxiety. But if you've got a bunch of them, you got a problem, okay? Trouble falling or staying asleep. The Romans, if someone had insomnia, they were considered to be a bad person. They said you can't have insomnia unless you're really, really afraid of something and you're overthinking, and you must be a bad person, okay? Now, shortness of breath, diarrhea, you name it. Headaches are often from anxiety because it changes your neurotransmitters. It causes more muscle tension, which definitely changes your blood flow. So these are all common symptoms of anxiety. My patient today had about 90% of them. Important thing here is the bold. It says, when you feel anxious, your body releases hormones that prepare you to react to a threat, and that's called fight or flight. It's actually called fight, flight, or freeze. Some animals and some people will literally freeze, but cortisol activates your blood sugar, so it's just you're using tons of blood sugar. Epinephrine makes your heart beat really fast. Norepinephrine pulls the blood out of the center, out of your organs, your ovaries, your stomach, etc., and puts the blood into your brain and into your hands and feet, etc., so that you can run away from the tiger. But while you're running away from the tiger, you're not digesting your food, you're not building a good egg in the ovary, etc. It's one of the primary causes primary, when someone comes to me, a woman comes to me with unexplained infertility, my first thought is anxiety and stress. And I'm almost always correct once I start doing some testing in the clinic and then also order some blood tests and urine tests, that you'll see this elevated fight or flight response, which is preventing them from getting pregnant. Okay. Here we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about clinical lab assessments. Here's our crack team at work doing the exam. And some of these following tests that I'm going to go over with are the tests that should be done for anxiety and unfortunately rarely are done for anxiety. So, adrenal stress and cortisol. This can be a blood test. It's usually done as a saliva test because to be accurate, you need to do cortisol test several times a day. And it's not very convenient to do a plasma or serum cortisol. So we do saliva generally for that. We can do urine testing, which will show a lot of accuracy also. And this will show imbalance in what's called the HPA axis. Excuse me, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Now, you have to remember that almost all, maybe all, hormonal responses in the body are feedback responses, right? So the body, there's the hormone secreted, it's being noticed, it's being noted in the hypothalamus, which is saying, okay, that's the right amount, or it's too low, or it's too high. And it sends a message, a closed circuit message to the pituitary gland that sends out one of the stimulating or trophic hormones, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocortical hormones, follicle stimulating hormone, et cetera. So it'll send out a message to either slow down or speed up the activity. And one of those axes is the adrenal axis. So it'll send messages to the adrenal gland, right? Create more corticosteroids, create more aldosterone to control sodium potassium levels, or control, put the cortisol in check, et cetera. Now, over time, those feedback loops can be damaged. So if someone is under stress all of the time, at some point, the system can break down. And it's like, oh God, this person's always at stress. That must be the necessary level of hormone. And so the pituitary sends out too many signals all of the time. So even when you're no longer anxious, you're still sending signals to release more hormones. MDs almost never check for these issues. I've been laughed at many times by conventional medical doctors when I'm talking about adrenal issues. Functional medical doctors will always check for these. They're at the top of their list. But MDs, no. We check for these a lot. I've been checking for these for over 20 years. So here, they're pretty easy to address once you identify them. So we do usually, you can do plasma or salivary, as I mentioned. You can also do urine, and not particularly expensive. These are, again, plasma is unlikely to be used. And if it is, it's going to be expensive because we're testing for different markers. If we're testing for common adrenal issues, saliva is relatively inexpensive and very easy to do. You spit in a little tube. It's really not all that hard. Okay, thyroid panel. Now your doctor will run a TSH, which can be very, very misleading. There are 27 identifiable forms of hypothyroid. That's not even including hyperthyroid. 27 identifiable forms, but you have to run the right tests to find them. If you don't look for them, you ain't going to find them. And there's a high correlation between thyroid laboratory values and anxiety. This can be a plasma, a blood test. It can be a urine test, or it can be a saliva test. Any of those can work. You just have to know how to, interpret the values for each one of those. And MDs rarely check for thyroid antibodies. And it's when you have the thyroid antibodies, or you have hyperthyroid, which you'll also generally have thyroid antibodies. that you see anxiety. It's very common. In fact, hyperthyroid, almost everybody has anxiety. And so the assessment of thyroid hormone production, peripheral conversion, the thyroid hormone has to go through conversion. So the hypothalamus is reading the levels all the time. It's talking to the pituitary. And if it says, hey, we need more thyroid hormone, it sends a jolt of TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. So when your doctor checks your TSH, they are actually not testing your thyroid directly. It is not a thyroid hormone. It's the thyroid stimulating hormone. So then the thyroid creates several different forms of thyroid hormone, basically T1, 2, 3, and 4. About 90% of it's T4. And T4 is released into your system. That's 4 iodine molecules bound together by tyrosine. And it doesn't do much. It just kind of mostly floats through your system. Then when you need energy, that converts to T3. So it breaks off an iodine molecule to become T3, and that's where you get the peripheral hormone conversion. It converts from T4 to T3. Problem: cortisol binds with T4 and prevents it from converting to T3 properly. Also, it causes the release of something called reverse T3, and reverse T3 tricks the body into thinking you have enough T3, but it only has about 10% the activity. So with those unexplained fertility patients, they almost always have high reverse T3 and high cortisol, so they're not converting to T3. And that's why last study I saw 56% of thyroid patients, when given T3 along with T4, felt better than if they took T4 alone, because part of their problem was conversion. And then you've got the cellular sensitivity response. So now you've got the T3. Is it triggering what it's supposed to trigger in the receptors? And we want to measure thyroid hormone antibody activity, because if you have antibodies to your own T4 or to your own thyroid peroxidase, which is an enzyme needed to produce thyroid hormone, then we got a whole different ballgame. Now, if your MD does test for those, and they found that you have high TPO or thyroantiglobulin problems, they treat that the same as if you just have a low thyroid. Well, we don't. We treat the thyroid, hormone, but we also know that we need to get your thyroid gland not to be on fire anymore, right? And by the way, the number one stimulator of high TPO, by far, more important than everything else put together, is gluten. I've had patients go from a TPO level of 1,200 down to 120 in 6 weeks by stopping gluten. So it's huge. So anyway, we put all those different things together and we figure out what's actually going wrong with your thyroid. And that can have a huge role in anxiety. Then allergy and food sensitivity. We're talking about the gut. And so you're going to have allergic responses really to anything, right? But foods, very common, inhalants, environmental chemicals, et cetera. And screening now is very, very easy for this. You can do it with just a blood spot, 1 spot of blood, sometimes 2 spots of blood, to do a ton of testing looking for food allergy responses. Again, the prices on all of these tests are coming down. They're actually quite affordable now. Organic acids testing. So this is a urine test, and this doesn't test directly for problems. It tests indirectly for them, right? And so we see how the body responds and what markers, what biomarkers or biochemical intermediates are in the urine. And so then we can see if you're processing dopamine properly. Do you have enough dopamine? Are you processing it properly? Are you creating and utilizing too much epinephrine? Are you creating too much norepinephrine? How's your serotonin level? Do you have a high exposure to molds? Do you have a high exposure to bad bacteria in your gut? Do you have a high exposure to even worse bacteria in your gut? Do you have a high exposure to yeast in your gut, et cetera? And it actually will tell us a lot about what's happening in the actual energy cycle, the Krebs cycle. It's amazing when you start to see all of the things that start to show up there. So amino acid levels, nutrient cofactors, minerals, fatty acids. It's an astonishing test, an organic acids test. Relatively new, relatively inexpensive. Just looking at these two things here, vanilla mandalate and homovanillate, will tell you about norepinephrine elevation. And norepinephrine and epinephrine each have their precursor as dopamine. So if you are using too much norepinephrine, too much epinephrine, you're going to have diminished stores of dopamine. You have diminished stores of dopamine, you're going to be anxious and or depressed. And you won't want to do anything. You won't want to get off the couch, right? If you have low dopamine, nothing is fun anymore. Life is kind of a drudgery. And that's often low dopamine. And then we see these high levels of neurotransmitters associated with the inability to manage stress. And in this particular organic acids test that we generally run, there are 76 different biomarkers present. It shows a lot. And another one in the organic acids testing is pyroluria. And I've only seen one doctor ever test for this, but it's a very, very common problem for anxiety. You also see it in a lot of mental emotional disorders. And in this one alcohol treatment center, 1/3 to 1/2 of alcoholics have this marker. It's high. And high levels of pyrols, is I think the pronunciation, bind to B6 and zinc, preventing the use of those in the body and the brain. And B6 and zinc are two of the most important things in the body to provide energy. And so here you get a myriad of symptoms. You get cardiovascular problems, attention, anxiety, poor stress control, total fearfulness, and some episodic anger. Okay, that's as far as we're going to go today. I want to cut this one a little bit shorter, but that gets us kind of. I wanted to show you that there is a problem that is very common beyond what you've been told is a problem, and also that there are tests for all of these. And once you identify the problem with the testing, there are treatments for all of them. And many of them, they're obscenely simple treatments, all right? So that's it for today. I will be back next Tuesday at 3 o'clock, and I should be on time next time because I don't have another webinar before. And we're going to go into some really, really fun stuff. So I want to thank you for tuning in. Send us some questions. I love what you've been doing so far. Be happy, be healthy.